So I kind of have a long sort of background, I suppose, in being curious about and interested in Gregory Bateson's ideas and his contributions, not just to family therapy, but to ecological thinking. So I kind of decided to see what I could do to sort of look at what the roots are in terms of ecology in our profession. All the photographs are ones that I've taken, and they're sort of generally sort of the local area. They're either Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, or the coast nearby. So hope you like these two. But now I'm struggling to go on to the next stream. There we go. So if we go on to Bateson, he kind of said there's an ecology of bad ideas, just as an ecology of weeds. And when you narrow down your epistemology and act on the premise, what interests me is me, or my organization, or my species, you chop off consideration of other loops or the loop structure. You decide that you want to get rid of the byproducts of human life and that Lake Erie will be a good place to put them. You forget that the eco-mental system called Lake Erie is part of your wider eco-mental system, and that if Lake Erie is driven insane, its insanity is incorporated in the larger system of your thought and experience. And I kind of thought about that because it really made me think, well, as a discipline, as family therapists, systemic practitioners, have we been guilty of doing this very thing? Focusing on the bits of Bateson's theories that interested us and just casually chopping off the rest. And no, we don't need that. And in Sacred Unity, which if people haven't read, I mean, I know most people read Steps and maybe Mind and Nature, but I think I find a lot of the richest of Bateson's writing is in Sacred Unity. And a quote from here is, theory is becoming available to action-oriented people whose first impulse is that which is primarily in empiricism. Take it on the wads and try it. Don't waste years trying to understand the theory. Just use whatever hunch you seem to follow from it. Such people are likely to be frustrated and their patients hurt. Theory is not just another gadget which can be used without understanding. And for me, I think there's something about understanding what Bateson was really trying to tell us. The systemic practice, the relational ideas around how people's problems maybe emerged out of relationship. That was part of his thinking, but he was offering us so much more. And I suspect that Bateson was actually hoping that as a profession, we might be more inclined to sort of take up his wider ideas, not just take the ideas and use them in the clinic room. I don't know if is this sort of working with the pictures. I don't know if you can everyone see all that. You can probably move my face with your mouse, so you're not having to look at my face and read this at the same time. So a little bit more from Sacred Unity. The basic rule of systems theory is that if you want to understand some phenomenon or appearance, you must consider that phenomenon with the context of all completed circuits which are relevant to it. And he goes on to say that thinking this might even lead the human race to a sort of wisdom that would preclude the wanton destruction of our biological environment and preclude some of the very peculiar attitudes we exhibit towards patients, foreigners, minorities, our spouses, and our children, and even each other. And I just felt that this was probably one of the most important quotes that kind of fits for today, what we're seeing around us in the world. And I think as systemic practitioners, we need to be thinking more widely. So to go back to sort of thinking about family therapy in particular, I kind of have hunted high and low for where were the ecosystemic ideas in family therapy, and in effect the conclusion that I had to come to is that the term ecosystemic really refers to thinking about the context of an individual within a family, and in some cases community. And I think perhaps Edgar Auerswald was the only person who really tried to sort of think beyond those contexts in some of his writing. But some quotes here. Ecosystemics is concerned with human autonomous systems, from Tyler, 92. Auerswald in 67, the ecological systems approach ensures that the entire process of planning for a community is rooted in the realities and needs of that community. Bradford Keeney in 79 said ecosystemic epistemology can now be defined for diagnosis as a way of knowing problematic situations through the epistemological framework or paradigm representing cybernetics, ecology, and systems theory. And perhaps he was on the touch of thinking more broadly about problematic situations that people experience, but thinking about them from sort of wider perspectives. Another quote from Auerswald, and I think this is quite an interesting idea. I believe that Bateson, by dipping into our field, provided a conceptual link between the thinking of family therapists and the epistemology of new science. What emerged in our thought has acquired the label of ecosystemic epistemology. So that's back in 1987, but there hasn't been a lot since. There's perhaps one person, and I'll come to her later on, who has been maybe running with these ideas more overtly from a systemic perspective. By the way, if you want to interrupt me, or you want to ask any questions or make a comment, please do unmute yourself and interrupt me. I interrupt people all the time, and it's only fair. So just moving on, I think that maybe the move from first order to second order is kind of part of this thinking. The ecosystemic perspective maybe was part of the shift from an anti-contextual and reductionistic epistemology concerned with objectivity and truth to a worldview that encompasses complexity, contextual patterns of relationship, and multiple realities. So maybe we could argue back to Bateson that we were using his ideas as more than a gadget, because the shift from first to second order thinking was and probably still is transformational. But in my view, there's very little evidence that early family therapists considered wider ecological aspects of responsibility or practice, despite Bateson's insistence that humanity's conscious purpose was setting us at odds with the very ecology that we're part of. And I remember back in the 80s, before I trained as a family therapist, I was a nurse, and I did NLP training. And part of NLP was talking about an ecologically well-formed outcome. And I think that the roots of strategic family therapy and very much tie in with NLP and solution-focused therapy too. But the idea is that people think of a structurally an ecologically well-formed outcome, again, refers really to the ecology of the person and their life rather than the wider ecology. So the consideration really is that somebody's ecology is their family, perhaps their community. So really missing the whole kind of the wider ideas about our relationship to our environment in its totality. I found somebody called Val Featherstone, and she actually worked at Hull University, and she must have left when I started working there in 2003. But I found this quote from her, which I thought was really quite helpful. And it really got me to think that some of the writers that I'm really engaging with now are feminists. And I think maybe the feminist critique of family therapy offered some possibilities, but certainly critical feminism offers us some possibilities in our thinking too. But this quote from Val Featherstone: in a feminist ideological framework, life is an evolving process and is seen in multidimensional terms. Thus, there is no grand cure or final fix for presenting problems. And she goes on, therefore, it's considered that yet another paradigm shift could take place within family therapy, a feminist, ecosystemic, or ecological perspective and way of thinking being a preferable model when helping families, particularly independent families. I need to find out more about Val and what she's doing now, because I found that and I just felt it was really important. But I'm also reading current thinkers like Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, Rosa Braidotti, and Anna Singh, who are showing us other routes that maybe will help us follow more closely in Bateson's footsteps as a profession. And the mushrooms, because of the Anna Singh book, so they were just growing in the garden last year, so I'll share that with you. So is Bateson still relevant? And I would argue emphatically, yes. Let's look at the loops that we've perhaps missed in his thinking. Let's reconnect with his thinking. Bateson's call to us wasn't to simply think about the systems of the people we serve and the context of their lives. He was asking us to think systemically about ourselves, our own lives and responsibilities to each other, to our environment, for we too are part of the whole. And to quote Karen Barad, we are responsible for the world of which we are a part, not because it's an arbitrary construction of our choosing, but because reality is sedimented out of particular practices that we have a role in shaping and through which we are shaped. And it's interesting, you know, again, there's a picture of my grandson there looking at the vast sort of ocean in front of him, and that sense of how I'm connected to him, I'm connected to that ocean, I'm connected to his future, and I want him to have a good future. Not just the families that I work with.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, of course.
Sometimes I think when you're presenting, it's nice to have some interruptions. Kind of makes you feel like you're more in dialogue.
Yes.
So hopefully you don't mind. I was just thinking of your grandson there, and just thinking how, you know, we're all connected to your grandson, and of course your grandson is connected to all of us.
Yes.
And the decisions we all make today are part of his future. Yes. And his future is part of us. Although we might not be, those of us in the room today, in our different rooms, might not be what we might think of as alive in your grandson's future. We will be part of it nonetheless.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking of beach litter, because I'm looking at your grandson on the beach there, and you know, plastic in our oceans and litter on our oceans, and in our oceans and on our beaches, and what a problem. You know, and how much that's been highlighted over the last few years, even though, you know, we've been aware of it for so much longer. And you know, a plastic bottle, what we think of as single-use plastic, will be longer on this earth than me and you, and indeed your grandson, in its current form and in our current forms. So that idea that, you know, people that you're talking about, like Rosie Bradotti and Karen Barad, etc., you know, that kind of move to sort of new materialism and and Donna Haraway to think about, you know, think about matter as mattering, you know, in our worlds, and how we all have to grapple with that. But, you know, these ideas, as you say, always remind me of Gregory Bateson's work and indeed Laura Bateson's work.
Yes, thank you. It's quite interesting because the photograph that I showed when about Lake Erie showed a small lake, and that's actually very close to where my mother's ashes are scattered. And for me, there's this just sense of where we are, and we're never really gone as well. But maybe that us never really being gone could be in a more helpful way than the plastic bottles that are never really gone. Thank you. And if anyone else wants to interrupt, please, or comment, please feel free. Some more of my photography here, but again from Sacred Unity, Bateson said it's not a new idea that living things have immanent beauty, but it is revolutionary to assert as a scientist that matters of beauty are really highly formal, very real, and crucial to the entire political and ethical system in which we live. And I think there's something for me about noticing beauty around me. And that again can be in the clinic, in the therapy setting, is the beauty of the people, in who they are, and how they've managed and dealt with their difficulties. Or it can be just going out into the garden and reconnecting, or going for a walk by the sea. But obviously there's more to it than that in terms of thinking and epistemology. And again, back to Sacred Unity, rather late picture of primroses. I suddenly realized that I needed to go out and take a picture of some primroses for this slide, and they were starting to look a little bit tired, but still. And Bates says that the quote is, "A primrose by a river's brim, a yellow primrose was to him, and it was nothing more. And Bates says, well, on the other hand, if you see a primrose and it is something more aesthetically, then I suspect that the primrose contains formal characteristics of symmetry, imperfect symmetry, complex interwoven patterning, and so forth, which indicate that the primrose itself is a mentally governed piece of morphogenesis, and that the aesthetic thing is a recognition of that, for better or worse, for beauty or ugliness." And I think that it's kind of important to recognize that Bateson, in his later writings, very much became concerned with the idea of the sacred. Although he was an atheist, he appreciated the value of religion in helping us understand what might be sacred. And I think that the connection between aesthetics and the sacred is really, really important in Bateson's thinking. So I just thought I'd throw that in as something to think about. And sort of go back to the rubbish. This is at Filey on the brig. The image of a tar presumably used to sort of tow fishing cobbles into the sea, and it's just been discarded. But I think Bateson was right to be concerned about the precariousness of our situation and of our hope of survival as a species. And clearly the survival of other species is a huge issue right now. We are losing species every day. And Anand Singh writes, precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control even of ourselves, unable to rely on a stable structure of community. We are thrown into shifting assemblages which remake us as well as our others. We can't rely on the status quo. Everything is in flux, including our ability to survive. And I think that this, for me, is how do I integrate these ideas as a human being? How can this influence my practice as a therapist, but my practice as a human being? And where are those connections? And I haven't got the answers. This is what we're doing now, is maybe finding answers, finding ways through. So where did the eco go? Well, in terms of our profession, I don't think it was there, really. I think that it's only more recently that we've started to claim a wider ecological sense of sensitivity and sensibility. So maybe we're rediscovering the relevance of Bateson's cybernetic epistemology. And given that our discipline already has the benefit of being able to think and act systemically, although some people might argue that it's not an exclusive gift to us, and certainly there are plenty of systemic therapists who possibly aren't as well positioned for whatever reason, but maybe we're in a position to start to make trouble, to challenge the individualization of distress created by structural violence brought about by capitalism, patriarchy, and necropolitics. And those of you that are familiar with Vicky Reynolds will know she talks about necropolitics, but the necropolitics really comes from Rosa Bredotti's thinking. But I might be corrected that other people use that as well. The politics of death. The politics where we can have a government that actually is looking at how many deaths are acceptable versus cost to the economy. That's necropolitics. We're living in that. To challenge colonization, racism, sexism, and the othering of our kin, both human and otherwise, mountains and lions. And I'm thinking about Job and, the trees and even manufactured objects. So our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. I think if that could be a quote that kind of sums up, or maybe partly sums up what we're about, that kind of maybe works for me. And Tracy Laszloffli is probably one of the only writers that has been writing about ecosystemic therapy that I've found. She's comparatively recent author. She's an American author, and I've got a reference list to finish off with. But she says the concept of isomorphism suggests that it's important for therapists to model the change they wish to see in their systems. As therapists, we are committed to promoting healing and transformation in the lives of our clients. But that means we are ideally also a part of healing and transforming the world within which we all exist. And I hope that events like this is the start of something. It's not just for us as therapists, but maybe for us as people to make a difference that really will make a difference. So that's pretty much it. There's some light reading for you all.